Hello again. After this short break, welcome back to IREG 2021 conference. We're now about to follow an extremely interesting session on the globalization of science. And I'm happy to welcome to the studio Professor Peter Maassen, who will moderate the session.
Afternoon, and thank you for this introduction. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce this session to you and to moderate it about the globalization of science. And the globalization of science is all the more of importance in our current day and age, where the whole world is affected by a major pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. And only through the globalization of science, the intensive collaboration that has been possible and has developed over the last decades, were we able to develop a vaccine that was effective against the virus in a very short time. We've never before experienced in the history of mankind such a success of global science. And when it comes to global science, there are few humanities more globally connected and integrated than science. So this focus on the global dimension of science is of relevance, will be discussed in this session, and has to do with, of course, the current nature of the way in which science around the world is connected. Yeah, and it's a great pleasure for me to introduce to you not just this session, but the speakers, all well-known, renowned global scientists. The three presenters will bring their perspectives to this session based on their groundbreaking research and on their work within their specific universities and centers, and they will all bring their specific perspective and dimension to this important session on the globalization of science. Obviously, there is a focus on the rise of East Asia and especially China. It's remarkable, it's significant, it's impressive, it's important. But there are also other dimensions that I hope we can address in this session, if not during the presentations, then maybe in the discussion afterwards. Myself, I've been fortunate to have been involved the last 4 years in the work of two university alliances, a European and an African, in trying to contribute to an intensification and a strengthening of the science collaboration between Europe and Africa. And the four narratives that Professor Simon Morgansen introduced in a recent article about the understandings of global science as an open and expanding pan-national network, global science as an arms race in innovation between competing nations, global science as a world market of competing institutions, and global science as a center-periphery hierarchy, all are relevant for understanding the development of science in Africa and the growing interest around the world, not just from Europe, also from China, from North America, in collaborating and intensifying collaborating scientific relationship with Africa is a clear indication and a sign of the importance and the relevance of the topic addressed in this session, the globalization of science. As said, we have three excellent world-renowned speakers. I will briefly introduce them to you and also their papers, after which each of them will give a presentation of about 20 minutes, and we will have plenty of time afterwards to address the questions from the audience. Let me start with Professor Marek Krieg, who is a chairholder at the UNESCO Chair in International Research and Higher Education Policy at the University of Poznan, one of the most active and dynamic researchers in higher education in Europe. And his research area is quantitative studies of science, sociology of science, higher education research, and he currently focuses on international research collaboration, academic productivity, stratification in science, and global academic elites. Professor Kwiek has published more than 200 papers, book chapters, monographies, very active and productive scientist. He's been a Fulbright Foundation Scholar The list is too long for this introduction, and he will address in his presentation, which is entitled "The Dynamics of Global Science and New Tensions in Academic Knowledge Production," the dynamics of global science, by discussing the changing global map of science, the operations of global academic networks, and their impact on academic knowledge production from an individual, an institutional, and sector perspective. The impact of the globalization of science on higher education research will also be discussed by Professor Kwiek, after which he will share with us a number of lessons to be learned from the dynamics of global science. Professor Kwiek, it's a pleasure to welcome you and to give you the first presentation here in this panel. And after your presentation, we will continue with the other presenters, and I will introduce them and their papers accordingly. But we start with Professor Kwiek, after which Professor Morgansen, and at the end, Professor Aguillo. Professor Kwiek, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction. Yes, I would like to see my slides in a moment, but I'd like to say first, I'm doing a lot of studies into global science, and I'm enormously interested in tensions that emerge along different lines, like Western world versus post-communist Eastern European world, those countries which existed in global science for decades, and those newcomers which are coming to the global arena only recently. So you will hear a story about tensions, and my focus will be on both nation states and states on the one hand, and individual scientists on the other hand. So the macro level of states and the micro level individuals. You see, so the title is "The Dynamics of Global Science and New Tensions." A brief introduction to global science to all of us. Science definitely goes global today. We have global collaboration, but also global readership. We increasingly have global problems and academic knowledge production. Universities are enormously globalized social institutions, but at the same time, we need to remember one thing. All national science systems are embedded in emergent global science. So my story today will be about those tensions between global science and the national science systems. Certainly, all states want to harness global knowledge to national economic needs. It's natural. However, accessing global knowledge can occur only through us, scientists, through us, the academic profession. So we can say that the research power of nations today relies on the research power of individual scientists. This micro level is enormously important. And one more thing, global science is evolving. It is bottom-up rather than top-down. It's highly autonomous, and most of all, perhaps it's self-regulating. I'll be returning to this concept of self-regulation several times. Now, why academic scientists collaborate today? Very simply, scientists collaborate because they benefit from doing so. The crucial point is benefits. Benefits come in terms of promotion, tenure, or prestige, or finally access to research funding. Globally, not so much in the US, but globally, international collaboration matters. Science means self-organizing networks. They change from decade to decade and from year to day, and they span the globe. The globalization of science at the same time is perhaps the most potent aspect of modern globalization. When we say universities, we immediately understand globalization. Now, what drives global science, or what drives us scientists? The primary driver of global science is individual scientists who collaborate with the best of their peers wherever they are located. Global science and collaboration is mostly curiosity-driven. It reflects the ambitions of individual scientists for reputation and direction, both for works and for ideas. We disseminate ideas seeking reputation and seeking recognition globally. So scientists today may be increasingly collaborating as they wish, and if they wish, and to a large extent in the areas they wish. From a historical perspective, such a collaboration on a massive scale is absolutely unique. At the same time, there is a problem and there is a tension. While linking global science to national economic competitiveness is becoming difficult, at the same time, states view global science as necessarily linked to national economic prosperity. So we have nation states and we have individual scientists, and the states want to link the two, but it's enormously difficult. The map, the global map of science is certainly changing, and we know it. Professor Maassen mentioned China. Certainly, there is a larger, more competitive, multi-centric core of science today. It used to be Anglo-Saxon countries, but so a bipolar world of science, and today certainly it is being replaced by a tripolar world with Europe, North America, and Asia Pacific as major players in science. So the traditional Anglo-American academic hegemony is being challenged in many academic fields, and we can easily measure it by field. However, the ties between countries are than ever before, and what we receive as finally is what is termed the decentralization of science, what Simon Marginson terms the pluralization of science. So there are powerhouses such as the US, UK, Germany, and many European countries, but also newcomers, superpowers like China or BRICS economies or other new participants. So what says that the global map of science changes rapidly. Global science studies have a number of labels, and I want to discuss them here very, very briefly. What is the most important factor today? It's the accessibility of digital data. The data are about research funding, productivity, collaboration, or citations, or mobility, or many, many other dimensions of academic knowledge production. So we have new data, and you have new computer power, basically at fingertips. Not really at fingertips, we have to pay for it, but still we can access or buy new data, and we can access or buy new computer powers, especially computing power. So we are increasingly able to explore the structure of science today. What is possible today was not possible a decade ago, or even 5 years ago. So the globalization of science is explored under several conceptual labels. We can talk about science of science, or about meta research, or about quantitative science studies, or science and technology studies known for a long time, as well as we have input from other fields. These would be scientometrics, informatics, economics of science, and sociology of science. And I want to stress today in this presentation is there is enormous ongoing competition between the fields, and the competition is for scholarly attention, for public funding, and for policy attention. So the competition, that's one of the concepts important for this presentation. Finally, the globalization-driven big data revolution in science is utilized to study the globalization of science itself. We use either secondary data or we use raw data, but still we use big data. And this is part of the big data revolution. Well, what is enormously important, you can see the dollars on the right, and dollars matter, or bucks matter. Global science is nationally funded, and we can't expect to be globally funded or funded by any other sources. So despite globalizing pressures, science, career paths, universities, and finally research funding are all national. And this is one of those tensions I want to focus on. There is no global science without a national funding base for research and training. It requires national funding, also to keep us, scientists, and our costs running and our costs covered. So under the pressures of globalization, nation states are certainly less able than before to control their destinies, but at the same time, nation states are more dependent upon universities for knowledge production. We are important. science is important, and scientists and universities are in the center stage again. Just 2 slides about the operations of global academic networks, how global academic networks operate. There is a special dynamics of network formation and special dynamics of visibility. We know that science comes from any source at all, but still knowledge produced in universities with prestige and resources has higher visibility and it has higher status. We know how it works. We know that the highest publications is publications originating from world-class universities, located mostly in Anglo-Saxon countries, published mostly in English, and mostly in science, technology, mathematics, and medical disciplines. We just know it. And another set of rules is that global science is a constantly emergent system. There's one meaning of it. This is the outcome of a numerous independent, individual, and decentralized decisions of all individual scientists. So science is comprised of interacting individuals, us, and norms which are being formed as we speak. The norms emerge as we collaborate and as we publish. However, governing the academic community and steering its academic behaviors, like collaboration, is a very tricky issue. When we talk about the globalization of science, we mean globalizing countries, institutions, sectors, and finally individuals. Scientists involved in academic knowledge production leave traces in their printed publications, and we in quantitative social sciences, or we in higher education research, examine these traces. You can see the magnifying glass on the right. We are like detectives studying globalization. We have different data sources. These could be biographical or administrative or financial or publication related or citation related data. But we have also data at different levels: micro level of individuals, meso level, or finally macro level of countries. And also we use different reviews, we use surveys, and finally we analyze bibliometric data sets. So the globalization of science can be traced using temporal, time, topical, themes, geographical areas, and network who with whom analysis. This is what studies of globalization of science routinely do. Well, what is the impact of globalization of science on higher education research? We believe the impact is very important. So there is, or we can at least expect, increasing pressure to use much larger data sets and much higher numbers of observations to draw valid conclusions in our research. So we don't mean statistically significant results. We mean relevant, we mean attractive, and we mean convincing scholarly results, possibly with policy implications. So the world around us, scholarly world and policy world, expects larger numbers, and there is a pressure to use larger data sets. So in my area, which is academic profession studies, we have to go beyond standard analysis, and we need to use larger surveys and larger number of observations more often than ever before. Then another issue is that higher education research faces huge opportunities today, but it's surrounded by its competitors for scholarly and for policy attention. We need scholarly attention to be read, and we need policy attention to be useful. At the same time, new competitors to study science emerge, and then from various fields and disciplines. Education becomes one of many, and it has to fight to keep its status. It may be losing this competition if it's not using new data, new interpretations, new knowledge base, and it's important to be located in the future in those areas which are read and which are used, so which are attractive to both scholarly and policy communities. perhaps my question is, what is the best way to move forward? It is to keep the sophistication and to keep theorizations we use, but also to incorporate new tools and data sets for our purposes. We need basically to largely ask the similar questions or the same questions and new questions using data-intensive approaches. We need more and more and more data. Who is the major competitor to higher education research in this area? It is data science. It is also quantitative science studies, and it is also Scientometrics. So the contest is about what is valued in scholarly terms and what is publicly fundable. We need attention in higher education research, which is scholarly attention, but also we need public funding and we need policy interest. We need to be somehow applicable and somehow useful. So the keyword for education research in the future in this approach is complementarity. We need big data, we need surveys, and we need interviews. We need to consider new tools and new data sets arriving at our doorsteps. There are several lessons, 2 slides of lessons learned from the dynamics of global science. A first set of lessons is as follows. It is increasingly us, the researchers, rather than national authorities, who set the rules of how science is conducted. We set the rules en masse, voting in millions. What we do basically sets the rules. So in this sense, the global science system is somehow self-organized. It is embedded in the rules created by scientists themselves. We can't say it's everywhere, but it's in many parts of the world. The network model of science is an open system with opportunities open to new entrants being scientists and being countries. Collaboration patterns emerge from the choices of hundreds of thousands of scientists who shape the evolution of science networks, which we can study and analyze today. Self-organization and individual autonomy is the name of a game in town. The question is, how long will it last? Because there is a caution sign on the right, which you can see. Caution. However, new tools emerge. Global networks in science are indeed self-regulatory, almost semi-private in nature. Scientists indeed seek to maximize their own welfare. Scientists indeed satisfy their individual curiosity and the desire for weather. The question is it tenable in the future? And finally, these issues of autonomy in global science are enormously important. Networks in science cannot be easily controlled. They cannot be easily controlled by institutions, by countries, by public sponsored organizations. Global science is not easily controllable. Networks evolve continuously according to the needs of scientists. And we can see here the role of incentives. Scientists can be incentivized to behave in this rather than that matter. Incentives matter. We harness global science to local needs and national interests and economic prosperity of nations. It is important. The question is how to achieve this. And this is attention. Scientists need to use their autonomy, good, and need to protect autonomy in the future. But at the same time, policymakers need to do 3 things. First, understand what drives academic scientists in their work. It's enormously important. Understand. Second, understand the mechanisms of academic recognition. Peers matter. Recognition matters. It's not so much money, it's recognition. And finally, policymakers need to use these mechanisms to make global science nationally relevant and locally important, because a major tension is between what is global and what is national, or what is global and what is locally important. It's important because it has to be paid for by our states. Thank you so much. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much, Professor Kwiek, for this wonderful introduction and presentation addressing global dynamics of science and caution, with some cautions and also some recommendations for how we can move forward in trying to make better sense of this dynamics, amongst other things, by pointing to the importance of big data, of interdisciplinary collaboration, and of not marginalizing ourselves in our traditional fields. So thank you, and I'm sure we will come back to some of the issues that you raised later on in our interaction with the audience. But now I would like to move to the following speaker. That's Professor Simon Morgansen, Professor of Higher Education at the University of Oxford, where he's also Director of the Center of Excellence for Global Higher Education. In addition, he is the Chief Editor of Higher Education, the most global of all higher education academic journals, and he is a lead researcher with the National Research University, the Higher School of Economics in Moscow in the Russian Federation. Professor Morgansen is well known in our field and beyond. His research is focused on global, international comparative higher education, global science, higher education in East Asia, the public role of higher education, and a number of other topics. His work is embedded in a range of social sciences, and this includes political economy, political economics, political philosophy, and he's previously been connected to other well-known universities like UCL and Melbourne. Professor Morgansen is the most cited researcher in the area of higher education studies in the world, and he's been a prominent scholar addressing key issues that he will also highlight in his presentation. The presentation of Professor Morgansen is entitled Global Science in a World of Nation States, Do Those Who Pay the Piper Call the Tune? A very relevant question, and he will, in his presentation, discuss the relations as well as the distinctions, if not tensions, between the global and national science system. And in that sense, he continues where Professor Kwiek stops. He will, in his presentation, pay special attention to the science relations as well as confrontations between the US and China, and the growing strength of China as a global science power, a superpower in science. And based on his insights, he will share a number of key questions with us. And we look forward to your presentation, Professor Morgansen. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Peter. And it's a pleasure to take part in a session which is chaired by you as one of the mainstays of higher education research in the world. And I also want to thank Marek. I think this has been his session above all. He's organised it, and he's brilliantly, I think, articulated most of the main trends in the world higher education and science environment. And I don't think I'll need to work my way through them. He's done that really well for us. So I will just comment on some of the geopolitical issues that he and others have highlighted. I should say, too, that before I commence on the main presentation, that it's such a pleasure to share this with Isidro. We go back a way. We shared a platform in Hanoi in 2009 talking about rankings, and I really have always appreciated what Cybermetrics has done in foregrounding communication and the web as the central aspect of globalization post-1989. I really think that issue, which was very well understood, I think, when Castells was writing about the network society in around about 2000, it has to be brought back to attention, because the web is never something we should take for granted. It's enormously important to us, but it's also, like global science, in danger of being fragmented, overrun, overdetermined by the policies of national governments who just simply don't want to encourage free and open communication. Okay, global science. Let's go to the presentation. And it's a fast-changing landscape. Nothing ever stays the same in the world anyway, but in this particular area, so important, so influential to the world, we're seeing more change than we are in most spheres. And it's more global than most spheres as well. I'm not sure whether it was me who did that or the excellent IREG Secretariat, but never mind, we'll see how we go in future. Now, the important point that I want to emphasize is that science, as Marek said, is a dual system structure. You have a global science system, which is outlined as bottom-up in many respects. It's constituted by the voluntary activity of individuals and groups working as scientists, being brought together with others through the creative process and contributing to a common pool of publications. And that common pool of publications that's codified in the bibliometric collections in Web of Science and Scopus is perhaps the most important single material aspect to the global science system. The collaboration, which is ever growing in global science, works to that pool of publications. And the logic of that global system is very different to the logic of the national science systems around the world. Now, clearly these two things intersect. It's a complex intersection, as I hope to show you. But in that complex intersection, much of the issues involved in global science are playing out. And national science is not like global science. Global science is essentially, as Marek said, voluntary and bottom-up. And it's the collaboration of experts with each other. National science is ordered in a more conventional way in a set of institutions, through laws, regulation, policies, and protocols, habits as well, which also enter in the global system. But it's a formalism, the legal character of the national science that's different to global science. And also, of course, above all, the nation is the centre of funding of science. It's not funded globally, not very much. Global business sometimes comes into it. International organisations sometimes come into it, but it's really funded nationally. So you have this situation where it's being provided, constituted and funded nationally, but it becomes global at the same time. And the same people, the same leading scientists are working both to the world network and conversation and also accountable to their nation states and to their own universities. And those universities also have this kind of dual character. They're also working to a global network while at the same time working within a national context and funded and nationally determined in terms of policy. But I think the balance is a bit different. Science is more global than national. Universities perhaps are more national than global. But both of them work in the two spheres at the same time. Now, this table sets down for you in a bit more detail the distinctions between the logics and the behaviours of these two different science systems that have this full and complex intersection. Now, global science is not simply centred inside national science, nor is national science simply centred inside global science. It's not a simple exchange between the two. And there's no really direct line of causality between the national funding of global science and benefits to the nation. One of the core problems there is what you might call leakage. Global science is a single pool of knowledge. When nationally funded scientists produce science, it goes into the global pool normally. Most science is freely exchanged, freely available in the global pool. At that point, it can be accessed by foreign businesses, not national businesses, and they can gain an innovation advantage over national business. And at the same time, national business can gain its innovation benefits from science from the global pool, ultimately sourced from foreign scientists. So you can see that there's no direct relationship between national science and national industry innovation benefit. Of course, it helps industry to have science close by, and a country needs to be connected to the global science system, needs to have the expertise, needs to be able to access the cutting edge when it needs to know what's going on. But I guess the economic benefits are hard to manage efficiently. Nonetheless, what we see is this tremendous rate of growth of collaboration, core feature of the global science system, driven by the enthusiasm of scientists, but also encouraged and supported by universities that see benefits, status benefits for them in being associated with the global dimension of activity, and countries that see the benefits in being associated with global science as well. And on the whole, this relationship has been a positive synergy. You've seen the building of capacity in national systems then strengthens the position of the nation at world level, by increasing its global clout and status in science. At the same time, the growth of the global system drives national investment. Nations have to keep spending more to keep up with global science. So you've had this phenomenon of nearly all nations increasing their R&D budgets and increasing their university science budgets as a proportion of GDP in the last 25 years. I mean, sometimes you see countries going down, and Japan's been an outlier. It hasn't really increased its absolute budget for university science, and its GDP share has gone down. But most countries have steadily increased whether they're mature systems or they're emerging science systems. So far, so good. We've had this positive synergy. But the abiding fact is that science is funded by governments for whom the abiding purpose is not global cooperation or new ideas or helping scientists have better careers. It's national security and prosperity. I mean, they're national order, national protection, national prosperity, national economic and social development. They've always been the main driver of states all over the world since the first states appeared in China in the BCE period. And this world is a world where there's an oscillation between all-out competition between nation states and a kind of guarded zero-sum arrangement whereby they agree to tolerate each other and agree not to interfere with each other. An arrangement, that's the Westphalian framework that was established in Europe in the 17th century, which generally prevails as a sort of modus operandi between states, but periodically breaks down, especially when a very strong country decides to try and assert more control or more authority over all of the others, and that's been a frequent occurrence in the modern period. So you have a situation where science has to deal with the fact that it's sitting in this world of competing and bordered nation states, for whom the economics of science are somewhat uncertain. Some might even think if they're strong enough to go it alone, perhaps, to exit from the world science system. I think the United States and China may be big enough to do that, and possibly the EU, although the EU is unlikely to do it, given especially the closeness of relationships between the EU and North America in science. But those large blocs maybe have the option. All of the other countries, all of the smaller and emerging players don't have the option. Without the global science system, they're much weaker in science. So you've got the economics that are uncertain, with a couple of big players having the option of opting out and still retaining an economic position. And also the national security issues are by no means certain either. And as the world moves closer to a more militarized confrontationist environment, which it's now doing, then the national security questions around global science start to surface. And what we see now is a situation where, in the context of a more multipolar setting, we have a more uncertain world. Post-1990, post-1989, 90, and the development of the internet, we had an Americanized world, essentially, American-led world in many respects, economically, politically, culturally. And globalization was predominantly, in the first instance, an Anglo-European and perhaps Anglo-American form, in the sense that the English language dominated the early stages of the 1990s globalization, and those ways of thinking, those ways of doing business, those ways of organizing politics were in the ascendant. We're now in a situation where a range of other powers have become strong. Not just China, which is clearly in a very strong position as a country now, but also there's a range of middle powers, Russia, India, Brazil, perhaps Indonesia as an emerging player, and also countries like Korea. So you've got this joining Japan, which has always been a significant player. So you've got these non-European, non-American countries, which are now, if you like, disrupting the notion of a westernized world or an Americanized world. And in the age of global convergence, that's created a very new situation. You've got, on one hand, closer convergence than ever, culturally, even economically and politically in some respects. On the other hand, strong expressions of difference, strong variation within that close globalized setting. And that's not something we know how to manage. We're all groping towards how to deal with that. In the US, the impulse is to try and create the old dominance, the old hegemony, but with, China, Iran, India, and others now being significant players, it may not be very easy to hold the old Pax Americana as the way of managing the world. And China has become very strong. I mean, the interesting thing is that global science, as Marek has outlined it, is in many ways reflects American faculty protocols and ways of life. This not regulated by the state, open, free exchange, the good side, I think, of American society, American life, this tremendous openness and emphasis on decentralized creativity and freedom of exchange, that's patterned the way that global science has evolved. So in many respects, it seems to reflect that kind of American faculty style of social organization. And in that framework, you've seen different kinds of countries that are not Americanized or work or live according to American ways of doing things, becoming much stronger as science players and operating in the same way, in an open manner, through free exchange, through cooperation, and so on. And of course, China is the big example of that. The way China's science has come from, I guess, rudimentary state at the end of the Cultural Revolution, at the end of the 1970s, to the position it's now in is absolutely astonishing. And when you look at the high citation paper performance, you see that Tsinghua is now the #1 university in the world across the STEM disciplines in terms of high citation science. Not only in the top 5% papers, but also in the top 1% papers, the very peak of the very best science. Tsinghua is now well ahead of MIT as the world leader in producing high volume of high citation work. And in mathematics and computing science, China overwhelmingly dominates the list with the top 6 players, as you can see, and only one US university, MIT, in that top 15 group. And, in engineering as well. So you're seeing, and every year in the Leiden ranking, this China's dominance of STEM becomes stronger. So this is very significant. Of course, these sciences are strategically significant. I mean, not only China, but Iran and other emerging science powers are investing very heavily in the physical sciences STEM, the disciplines that have underpinned technological leadership in the world since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Those terrible events showed how powerful the application of science and technology to military strength could be. Yes, plays straight into the geopolitics, doesn't it? So we're on the cusp of this big change in the China-US science relationship. And this is not a small matter. I mean, this is a very large component of world science. The China-US partnership has been, in quantitative terms, much the biggest of all of the nation-to-nation partnerships. So it's more than 2.5 times the size of the next partnership, which is US-UK. And China's connection to the US has been much more important than all its other international connections in science, although it's interesting to see that the top 4 are all Anglophone countries. So with the Anglophone countries increasingly coming in behind the US in its global confrontation with China, suddenly you see the potential for a major fracturing of what have been a very successful set of partnerships in Chinese science. We'll go quickly to the next slide. And the story here in the US-China relationship is a transition from tremendous cooperation, officially at every level, supported by a complex set of and a positive set of partnership agreements, government to government, immense university to university exchange and agreement, collaboration, and lots of thousands of individual collaborations at the grassroots. And in that collaboration, China's moved from being a dependent and a weaker partner to being possibly the stronger partner in terms of what it puts into the STEM collaborations, with Chinese scientists leading most of the high citation work that is being done with the American scientists. And this is now all in jeopardy. I mean, the US government, I think, clearly would like to decouple China and US in terms of technology, and that means in terms of science, and sees China as drawing benefits from it that it would like to stem and stop. China, for its part, I think wants to continue the partnership, but is now probably strong enough to manage without it. So the situation has radically changed from what it was even 5 years ago, and perhaps the US decoupling, if it was intended to injure China scientifically, is too late. I think China has succeeded in building the science system that it wanted to build, although there's always more work to be done in building science in every country, isn't there? But the situation now is that I think we're going to see a decline in the collaborative publications, and certainly in the number of and exchange of collaborative agreements, the passage of students and staff between the two countries, and so on. So there's some big questions here for us. How far will the decoupling go? Will it eventually achieve a near absolute separation between these two science systems, or will there be, within the framework of an American science community, which is still only partly regulated by the state, continuing collaboration to some extent between grassroots scientists in the two countries and also between the universities? Which way will the leading universities jump? They've invested very significantly in their China work. Think of the PKU Stanford Center, for example, the commitment that Yale made to collaboration with PKU as well, and there's dozens of bricks and mortar based US university installations, the Harvard Shanghai Center, and so on in China. These universities don't want to walk away from that level of collaboration. Will China remain committed? I mean, China at this stage is perhaps the injured party, and it's staying in the collaborative world if it can, but China may well decide to pull up the shutters and say, look, we're not pleased with the way the Americans are behaving, or we don't see as much benefit in this collaboration as we did before. We're going to withdraw our commitment to it. So what will happen? And will the rest of the world follow the US? Will it follow China? What mixture of commitments will there be between the two powers? Will there be countries that try to remain on good terms scientifically and technologically with both China and the US? Will we have a Cold War in science and technology which separates the world into two feuding parts? Will we have a more complicated picture where the collaboration has been injured but not destroyed between China and the US, and there's a range of people in the middle, countries and individuals trying to manage a more complicated multipolar environment? What will be the consequences for the global science system that Marek has so brilliantly outlined for us today? Thank you for listening. Bye now.
Thank you very much, Professor Morgansen, for this dynamic and highly interesting and relevant presentation, emphasizing again the importance of global science to the world, and very attractively and intriguingly conceptualizing distinction between national and global science. What is, of course, of importance is the set of questions that you raised at the end, amongst other things about the consequences for the global science system. Will there be a continuous emphasis on science diplomacy as science the arena where relationships can continue that politically and economically have become more difficult? How does science diplomacy relate to geopolitics? And do we see the continuation of closer conversion as well as expressions of difference and expressions of difference in interest? So thank you very much for your presentation. Also here, building very nicely on the path that was laid out by Professor Kwiek. I'm sure we will come back to many of the issues in the discussion with the audience. But now it's time for our third presenter, our third prominent speaker, Professor Isidro Aguia, the head of the Cybermetrics Lab, which is a research group of the Institute of Public Goods and Policies and part of the Spanish National Research Council, which is the largest public research body in Spain. And the lab is developing research in several infometrics disciplines, scientometrics, bibliometrics, webometrics, and the most well-known work of the lab is the ranking web of universities, the largest and most updated one covering thousands of universities and other organizations and institutions involved in research. Professor Aguillo is also the founder and editor of Cybermetrics, and we are very much looking forward to your presentation, which is entitled Open Global Science in the Higher Education. Professor Aguillo will address in his presentation the openness of science and knowledge and the role of academia in this, the global nature of higher education, and the importance of the growing connection, not integration, of the global and local dimensions in science. Professor Aguillo, we're looking forward to your presentation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Peter. First of all, of course, thank you for the organizers for inviting me, especially Professor Marek, because it was his idea to have together all of us today. And also thanks to Simon for his words. I hope we can see again, perhaps in Madrid next time, because I would like to talk with him personally about a lot of topics he presented today. Well, I'm going to give you a presentation based on three topics that are described in the title. I'm going to talk about open, about local science, about higher education. But I want to stress first of all that when I refer to local, probably I am thinking about a specific part of the world that is Latin America. Of course, it's not only my main target, but clearly some of the ideas I'm going to introduce you are derived from my Latin American experience. So going to the presentation, as I mentioned, I'm going to talk about three topics: open science, global higher education, and local, that is the joining two words, local and local. And it's very interesting because in the original program of the conference, they make the mistake of using global instead of local. But this is important and interesting for me because it shows that we need to work on about this new topic, especially when you're considering the role of the local for developing global results. Well, regarding the global open knowledge, you know, now we have in Europe the development proposed by the European Union that is generally recognized as open science, a name that is perhaps not very correct, because although it is true that the idea is to open in the science, in fact, most of the open is related to the research activities. So the basic idea is we need to open the science when it is produced, before being published, and the second level is precisely after that the publication takes place. That means we need to open the impact of the results of the research once it has been published in a journal or in a monograph. This is very interesting, and I think it's important to support this idea, because at the end we are going to enrich the quality and the quantity of information making available to our peers. And here is my point. Most of this effort is mostly addressed to our peers, to other scientists. And I think it's important to go further beyond, because at the end, we need to go to not only open research, although European Commission talk about open science probably is even further beyond the concept that they call open science, but going even deeper to the concept of open knowledge, because we need to have into account not only the impact of the knowledge produced by the academia in other academicians, but in the rest of the world, in all the sectors, including, of course, non-academic sectors like economy, like social, cultural, or environmental aspects of this impact. For me, this is important, and clearly, here we have an important role for the academia. Academia is going to play, should play an important role here, because clearly, most of the knowledge is now produced inside the universities, inside the higher education institutions. And secondly, clearly, this knowledge produced in the academia is probably the most quality driven, the most quality content we are considering. And for me, this is called the Archipelago of Quality. All the information we are obtaining from academia, usually not not in every time, but usually is far better than other knowledge distributed by other actors. And finally, going into the previous slides, I think it's important for the academia to try to increase the impact of their results or of the knowledge they generated in other sectors, not only focusing on the impact on the rest of the members of the academia. For me, this is very important. And for checking this, I'm going to use the data we are collecting for the ranking web of universities. You know, ranking web of universities, as Peter has introduced before, is the largest one. We are working since 2004, and currently we are covering over 31,000 different higher education institutions. And we are going to use this data in order to show some ideas behind the previous slides. First of all, you need to consider the traditional way of checking the data in the rankings, that is a global north view. So in most of the rankings, you have access to the top 500 universities, or now it's becoming more popular, even top 1,000. And you can see our data are consistent with the data from other rankings. You can see most of the top universities came from North America and Europe, and increasingly the number of contributions from ECI, especially now from China, as Simon previously showed us, is really increasing. But this is a point of view that is not very good to reflect the actual situation of the higher education in the world. When you go to change your point of view and you adopt a global south point of view, you can see here the data very concerning, because you can see there is a huge number of institutions all around the south countries, but you can see that even in very powerful countries like Brazil or India or Indonesia, the number of his universities in the top 1,000 is very limited. And for most of the countries, you can see, for example, in the case of Peru, or in the case of Indonesia, in the case of Philippines, you can check the data in the figure. There is a lot of universities that are not taking into account in most of the rankings, and they are not benefiting of the information they can use for improving not only the rank position, but also the overall performance. And this is very important. Okay, you know, since Shanghai ranking was introduced, we are focusing on the so-called research-intensive universities. You know, this number, it depends of the editors, but usually most of us agrees that probably research-intensive university means about 1,000 top institutions, mostly of them located in the global north. But you know, there are not only 1,000, there are probably more than 30. I mentioned 30,000, but probably the number is even higher. 30,000 higher education institutions worldwide in the rest of the world that are targeting a lot of different disciplines, mostly professionally oriented, but you can see the topics are really very important, and some of the institutions not located in the top 1,000 are really very famous. I am thinking about some of the liberal arts colleges, or perhaps some small or medium-sized institutions devoted to economy and business, MBAs and so on. So we are losing a lot of information if we are not considering the contributions by these institutions that are as you can see, very large. But in fact, it's not true that these institutions are not making quality research. They are making a lot of research, and in fact, a lot of quality research. This graph is showing the number of papers in the top 10% most cited in Scopus. And you can see that, of course, there is a lot of universities that are producing more than 1,000 papers, these excellence papers, in the countries that you know in the north. But if you go to the rest of the table, you can see there is a lot of universities also in Africa, in Arab world, and in Latin America, in Asia, not China or Japan only, that are producing top quality papers. Perhaps not a lot of them, but they are producing top papers. You can see the total number of universities with at least one paper in the top 10% most cited is almost 7,000. Almost 7,000 higher education institutions are publishing at least one paper in the top 10% most cited. This data is from 26 to 20. This is important for analyzing the scenario, and we need to see what are the policies in order these universities or these higher education institutions can be a part of the globalization effort. And perhaps the word for describing this situation is local. But what is local? Well, local is a true effort for providing local information to the globalization effort in order to achieve, I think, clearly the SDGs goals, the SDG aims. Because at local level, clearly SDG goals are really very important. And the academia is, in most of the countries in these global south countries, are considering very seriously the target of the SDGs. So here we have the aim, but the problem is the access of data. We have very limited access of data, or better to better explain, we have a biased access to data. For example, you know, Web of Science of Scopus, we are using both of them for our analysis, are reflecting not the complete scenario, but only a part of it, and even worse, a part of it that is clearly incomplete. You can see here the numbers. There are providers that are providing clearly far more data than Web of Science or Scopus, and also, as I mentioned before, very biased data. And here we are only providing information about bibliographic records. Obviously, you need to consider also data sets, and there are millions of data sets already available, and many of them are produced outside from this global north we mentioned before. So it's important to have more access to more comprehensive and more inclusive information. Local. Well, local is a term, as I mentioned before, is a term that was not included in the original program. It was a mistake because people think about global, but local is a new term, and a term that you can see is not having a real impact, more or less, during the last 5 years. Local is a term that is well, part of the standard discussion, not related to this process of globalization. In fact, you can see there is a lot of mentions in in India and Nepal, because there is a university in India that is called a local university. Well, it's clearly very difficult to say what local is about. When you go to Web of Science, local is also a not very popular topic. There are some ideas regarding a specific aspect of the local contribution that is mostly related to cultural studies or art studies, and not very related to a scientific exchange of ideas. And I think this is important because probably local is an approach that should be more relevant in the future. And I think there are two models of local. One is the model that is currently the most popular, that is you try to solve local issues, but from a global perspective. I think this is not the correct one, because I think you need to be more global even when you are solving your local issues. And the second one is even worse, because at the end it's only filling gaps. There is a need of information at local level from the global partners, and they are trying to obtain this information for global purposes, but in fact these global purposes are global north needs, not really global south needs, no local needs. They are asking, they are requesting information from the south because they need for filling their gaps in the knowledge they are producing for any means. It can be for solving the problems or for comparative purposes. And sometimes this kind of cooperation, this kind of understanding of the local can be very incorrect. For example, sometimes when the Global South takes the initiative of cooperating with the Global North, sometimes the result is, unfortunately, global drain, because the facilities, the research resources, or even the money is more available in the Global North. And the end, the researchers from Global South that is starting to cooperate at the end decided to establish in the destination in the Global North. Global drain, you know, is a big problem for most of the Global South countries. The other approach, when Global North is leader in the approach, sometimes means that they try to obtain the resources or obtain the local knowledge from the Global South for their own purposes. So there is a knowledge transfer, but unfortunately the knowledge transfer is not from the north to the south, but many times from the south to the north. And finally, we have an interesting development currently, that is Global South cooperating with the Global South. It's becoming more and more important, especially at the regional level. For example, as I mentioned, inside Latin America, there is an increasing level of cooperation among the different countries. But you know, the problem of this Global South regional or global cooperation means that sometimes they are not reaching the standards of the Global North. So there is a real need for this kind of cooperation. You can list a series of suggestions for both for the Global North and for Global South. I would like to say that perhaps the most important for me is how the Global South should address this kind of action. And I think several important ideas. For example, when you are targeting local problems, you need to consider that these local problems are probably not so local as you think. And many of the developing problems, developing issues in Global South sometimes are probably equal or similar to these same problems in developed countries. So this is very interesting. There is questions about the language, for example. I think it's important that to consider that local doesn't mean to exclude the knowledge from third parties, especially when it's published in other languages. I am talking about English. And of course, another thing that is very concerning is the effort, the voluntary effort. In many cases, there is no enough resources at local level, and they try to fill this problem, to solve this problem with the help of voluntaries. And I think in most of the cases it's not working, because at the end, there is no sustainability for this effort, and the quality and in the long range, in the long term, is suffering. So I think, first of all, I think it's important to strengthen the local research capacity in order to face these problems. Well, summarizing, in order to give a space for debate, I'm going to say open, is beyond sharing knowledge inside academia. It's important in the actual the current emphasis on open science, but open science should be real opening the results of academia to the rest of the world, not only to other members of the academia. World-class status, the top 1,000 universities is obviously a very good scenario to analyze, but I think currently you need to consider not this very limited scenario, but to consider the whole higher education scenario with all the institutions, not only the top ones. And finally, if you are going to target, and I think at local level it's very important to target the achievement of the goals of SDGs, I think the only way to do that is not only a specific local approach or a generic global approach, but trying a hybrid approach that we call global. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Aguillo, for your presentation and for your focus on open science, and also pointing to the importance of not getting stuck with the top universities in the world. As you've shown, there's a lot of high quality science produced outside the universities that are at the top of the rankings. What we would refer to as pockets of excellence you find in many more institutions than in the most research-intensive universities in the world. Also, your argument that more access to more comprehensive and more inclusive data and information is necessary is extremely important, and we will take that further. I'm part of a Center of Excellence at the University of Stellenbosch, in addition to my position in Oslo, and there we exactly find the kind of patterns that you refer to. For example, that collaboration among African countries when it comes to scientific productivity has hardly increased over the last 20 years, while collaboration with countries outside Africa has multiplied. So how do we stimulate in this case, intra-African collaboration? And a number of your arguments are highly relevant there. So thank you very much. These are the three presentations, and I've already received a number of questions from the audience, so I will move to that immediately and give you a chance to respond to it. We have about 10 minutes for the questions. So the first question raised by the audience is the following: how can pressure on national science affect global science? Are there any risks in this respect, and how to avoid them? So the pressures on national science that Professor Morgansen, as well as Professor Kwiek and Aguillo referred to, are there any risks and how to avoid them? Who can I give the word to address this question?
Let's start with Marek.
Marek, okay, go ahead.
Thank you so much, colleagues. Very briefly, the risks are enormous, I would say, and the major risk which I can see is public funding. If we are also bloody globalized and so bloody internationally collaborating, and we are so irrelevant locally or irrelevant for national security or national prosperity, we will not get funded. And this is a major point I would like to make.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Any of the other members of this session who want to? Simon, go ahead.
Yeah, in a curious kind of a way, the geopolitical tensions actually increase the need to keep in touch with what other nations are doing and with global science in that sense. So I don't think any nation can really afford, in terms of especially national security issues, to actually exit from the global system. So that means maintaining national capacity, maintaining good, strong scientists, giving them security and supporting their work, and funding it where necessary is really crucial. That isn't to say that nations may not make foolish decisions about this, but I think the kind of modern imperative to keep up with the global system will fortunately keep everyone in to a large extent.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Let's move to the next question, and there's, amongst other things, a question for Professor Aguillo. And that's, should American universities, South American universities, take to strengthen their position on the global education market? And another question related to that is, what's the impact of changes in global science in the South American market? So what, according to your data and your the work done in your center, what can be said about the position and also the challenges and the path ahead for science in Latin America?
Well, I think the biggest problem in Latin America and perhaps in other countries of the global south is the level of investment in research and development. You need to take into account that probably only Brazil is spending more than 1% of the GDP to the research and development, and even for other countries of the region, the level of investment is below 0.5%. So this is important to increase the research capability of these countries, and the only way is to invest far more. And regarding the best strategy to improve their performance in this global area, I think there are a very good initiative that is increase the regional cooperation in the case of the continental cooperation, but also with other countries of the global south. For example, I know there are already in Latin America very good links with South African partners in order to develop joint projects and try to raise the output and the performance of their institutions using this kind of cooperation. The problem with globalization regarding South American universities is most of this globalization is done at individual level. So a few individuals are cooperating at a high level with the global north institutions, but at the end, most of them are deciding to go to the global north for finishing or their projects or developing his or her career. You need to think about a lot of examples about that. For example, you can consider the physics, particle physics. Many South American scholars are going to the CERN, or the same applies to the astrophysical research or to the medical research. At the end, the problem is these individuals has not facilities in their own countries for being part of the globalization. And this is important because they are really actors of the globalization effort, but they are going from the south, where this is not possible, to the north, where more facilities and funding are available.
Thank you very much. And the same is the case, of course, in sub-Saharan Africa, where also the percentage of GDP invested in R&D, there's no country which has more than 1%. South Africa is currently the highest with 0.7%, and most countries are below 0.3% of GDP. And also the number of researchers is significantly lower than in the rest of the world. But thank you. Another question, and that is question especially to Simon, but also to Marek. The confrontation between US and China is increasing. How will this situation translate into the scientific cooperation all over the world? So in other words, the patterns that you, the dynamics that you refer to, how will that affect the way in which global science will develop in the coming decades? Simon, can I give you
a big question, isn't it? And you know, one of the things I've learned in my career is that, although despite the conceit of social scientists, we who parade ourselves as predictors of the future and show ourselves to governments accordingly, unfortunately, we're not very good. No one's very good at knowing what the future is going to hold, because it's impossible to know. And I think this is never more true than in relation to the big geopolitical developments, because these are such large-scale changes that they can send so many other changes into operation. My gut feeling, and it may be wrong, is that there'll be pressure put on many countries to change their relationship with China or with the US in the coming period in science and in all other areas. And I think that neither the US nor China are as strong as the US was in the Cold War period, or for that matter, perhaps in some ways the Soviet Union was. And what you might call the non-aligned movement, and also the plural movement, people who are dealing freely with everyone, even if they've got a stronger relationship with one side than the other, will be a very large component. So I think there'll be a good deal of freedom of manoeuvre, but there'll be a lot of attempt made to create dependency relationships and, in some extent, coercive relationships by the big powers to pull the small powers into line. So I think it'll be a more difficult period in science and technology diplomacy than we've seen for a long time.
And with the eye on the clock, I would have one final question where both Marek and but also the other members of our session can contribute. But that's the cooperation between South and North is extremely important, and what tools should be used to bring cooperation closer. And may I add an element to it, because we haven't addressed the notion of the next generations of scholars. And if we look at the demographic developments, including China, in most of the advanced science countries, the population growth has changed into a population decline. And if we look at the only continent where you really see a massive growth, Africa, the expectations are that by somewhere in the 2030s, more than half of all students in absolute terms in the world will come from Africa. So what does also this aspect, the demographic aspect, play in the further development of South-North relationship in science? May I start with you, Professor Kwiek?
Yeah, I believe demographic is enormously important in studying global science. I'm right now studying the graying of the academic profession globally, and my previous results show that in the West there is a real graying of the academic profession, and in the South, so to speak, as opposed to the North, there's an increase of young scientists, and the academic profession is enormously young. And these patterns will be changing over time, because we see young scholars are much more collaborative than older scholars. And there's a difference between disciplines as far as collaboration is concerned. So demographic is one of those issues, demographics of countries, but also demographic of scientists is enormously important to study. But I have no answers at this point.
Professor Aguillo, the cooperation with South.
Yes, you already focused the point of the issue, because the global North is getting old and the global South is getting younger. So you can expect this kind of cooperation is possible, because the global North, with their experience, with their knowledge, with the facilities they have, are in a position to offer to this younger generation from the South opportunities to develop the science. And probably in this way, a better understanding of the different cultures could be possible, because if we are in a position of accepting more and more younger people from the South, because our current generation is getting old, and most of them are going to retire in the following years. I think this is an important contribution. But again, the problem here is probably political, because we need to open our frontiers to these people. We need to open the frontiers from the global North to the younger people, younger scholars from the global South. It's a political issue.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Simon, do you want to add to that?
Yes, I do, and I want to thank Isidro for his excellent presentation around the North-South issue. Thought you really brought forward some important considerations. The logic of North-South in science is like the logic that we've just seen played out at very disappointing COP26. I mean, I think that the outcomes fell well short of what we needed there. And it was mostly because countries pursued their own self-interest. Now, in relation to the demographic issues in science and the development of the global south, there's every danger that the global north will throw the door open to talent from the global south and will keep that talent. And what really matters, as Isidro so clearly said, is capacity building in the global south, not scholarships that don't send people back, but scholarships that send people back and then provide income and infrastructure and support for the development of really strong institutions in the global south. Instead of spending 80% on pulling people out of the global south, we should be spending 80% of our money on putting people into the global south and keeping them there and strengthening the global south. In the end, it all comes down to states, state policies, the willingness of states in the global south to do the right thing, to take the long-term view, to develop non-corrupt approaches, and to do what Korea did. I mean, in 1960, Korea was one of the poorest countries in the world. And look at it now. What an astonishing country it is now. What a great contributor at global level it is now. And that shows what you can do if the politics is right as well as the science.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And from that perspective, I would like to also to point the attention to the new Horizon Europe and the Erasmus Plus program, where the European Commission has dramatically increased the budget available for building capacity in the south. The budget is approaching €1 billion for the coming years, with the intention, as Simon indicated, to contribute to dramatic investments in capacity in the south, also by stimulating collaboration of universities in the south. So south-south partnerships will be identified and supported there. So there are positive programs that take also the dangers that Simon was referring to, the brain drain and brain gain game as a real issue to deal with. With that, I would like to thank, of course, our presenters, the Professor Aguillo, Professor Morgansen, and Professor Kwiek for their wonderful and insightful contributions to the session. First of all, of course, their presentations, but also their very insightful answers to the question. And I'm looking forward to your further work in this, and I hope that we will have a chance in the near future to also jointly address the issues that we have raised here, because they are of key importance for understanding not just science in a global world, but the development of our nations. So thank you very much. And with that, I give the floor back to Julia and to the next session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, respected speakers, for this extremely informative session and discussion. And now we are going to have a short break again and see you back here at IREG 2021 in just 10 minutes.